Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and in this video I'm going to have a look at some artists' acrylic paints. Over the years, I have accumulated a fair selection of these cheap artists' acrylics, but so far I haven't really tried running them through my airbrush. I figured that would be a good idea for painting large areas like terrain pieces and structures. So I decided to give it a try. Now, I'm not any kind of expert on paint quality or pigments or anything like that, and I'm not really going to be doing any in-depth analysis or anything too crazy. I'm just going to try a bunch of things to see what works, and I figured why not document my findings and share with everyone. The main reason I'm doing this is the fact that model paints that I normally use from companies like Vallejo aren't really cost-effective to use on large areas, even though they definitely go through the airbrush very well. These artist acrylics are significantly cheaper and thus much more economical for terrain and large areas. I'm going to start by squeezing a little of each paint from the tube onto some cardboard to see how they look and handle. The first colour will be this burnt umber from a company named Micador. As you can see, this paint is rather thick. The blob pretty much stays exactly where you put it. Even when turning the cardboard sideways, this paint does not seem interested in moving. Tapping the cardboard on my bench does force the paint to run a little, but as you can see, it's still more or less one thick blob. I used an old brush just to see how well this paint handles being brushed. This is a cheap old brush, but I'm not sure using a new good quality brush would alter the paint's handling a whole lot. You can see it doesn't have the greatest coverage. You would have to do quite a few coats or lay this stuff on really thick if you want good coverage. It also seems to get a pretty streaky result, which should be fixed by thinning. However, that thinning would cause the paint to require even more layers for good coverage. I think you could probably almost use this paint as a texture paint. Stipple it on and you should get little brown bumps in the surface when the paint dries. I don't think it will level out at all. To be honest, I don't think this paint is really worth trying to thin down for airbrushing. Let's move on to this raw umber from Mont Marte? Mont Marte? I have no idea how that should be said. As you can see, this paint costs $2.99. This one is also quite thick. That shouldn't be surprising. These kinds of paints will almost always be very thick. Like the Micador paint, this colour also doesn't flow very well and really seems to prefer staying exactly where I squeezed it out of the tube. Even when I tap the cardboard on the bench, it's still quite resistant to moving. It looks to me like this has a slightly better coverage than the burnt umber, though it's still pretty streaky. It's not too surprising that this stuff handles in a very similar manner to the previous paint. I'm pretty sure this blob will retain its shape when left to dry, rather than leveling off and forming a pool. I think this one might actually be a better candidate for being thinned, both for brush painting and running through the airbrush. The next test subject is this chestnut from Burrows. This is obviously a bigger tube than the previous two colours, though it does come out of the tube much the same way as the previous colours. Maybe a little more fluid, but still very thick and resistant to spreading out under its own weight. It seems to flow a little more freely while being tapped on the bench, though not much. This has a very slightly better coverage than the previous two colours, but it does still have that streakiness and unsurprisingly handles much like the other paints. This is probably also worth trying to thin for airbrushing. The next paint I'm going to try is this black from Art Culture. It's a student's acrylic paint. I don't really know how that differs from artists' acrylics. I think they're likely to be pretty much the same. This stuff is really thick. It didn't even really settle onto the cardboard. It seems to have a very slightly different consistency than the other paints. It almost looks chunky and much less smooth. The blob almost fell off the cardboard rather than spread out when I first tried tapping it on the bench. It did spread out surprisingly well after that though. Brushing this on, it seems to have pretty good coverage. I guess it must have a lot of pigment in it. It does still suffer from that streakiness, but I think if you really wanted to, that could easily be mitigated. This stuff seems like it would work quite well for dry brushing applications because of its thickness. It might be a little too thick to be entirely practical for thinning to run through an airbrush, but I might as well give it a try anyway. And finally, I have this provincial beige from Sonja. This is the only paint I was really expecting to be any different from the rest. The reason for that is, the tube says matte fluid acrylic, and as we can see, it obviously has a lot more fluidity to it than the other paints I've tried. It is still kind of thick, but you can see it does flow quite well, even without tapping it on the bench. So you can see why the word fluid is on the packaging. It brushes really nicely and smoothly. Unfortunately, this colour is a little bit hard to see on this cardboard, but you can see it does cover fairly well. There are still brush strokes there, but they're nowhere near as obvious as with the other paints I tested. I do have a few few other colours from this company, and I think this is going to be the best choice for running through my airbrush. However, I will still try out the other colours just to satisfy my curiosity and see what's possible. Before we do that, let's look at how the first tests have dried. The burnt umber has dried very streaky, except of course for the areas I left very thick. The paint has shrunken down a little bit as it dried, but there is still quite an obvious 3D texture to it. Not really the effect I'm looking for today. The raw umber turned out quite similar, but it has a little better coverage and the streaks aren't quite as bad. It would look reasonable after a few coats, I think. The chestnut seems to have really held its 3D shape. Not that that was really a goal, but it kind of looks like I made a little orange wave. It's kind of cool. The coverage I got was alright, maybe somewhere in between the first two colours. Streaky, but it would probably be alright after a few coats. Still not something I would paint an actual miniature with though. Now the black. I'm actually kind of happy with how this looks. It covers quite well, even though it does have some streaking and raised parts where I left the paint quite thick. It might not be good for airbrushing, but this would surely be useful to brush paint anything large that needs to be black. And finally, the provincial beige. This seems to have covered pretty well. Not perfect, but still pretty good. It would only take maybe 1 or 2 more layers to get a good solid coat. There isn't a lot of streaking except for the areas where I left the paint very thick. What I really like about this is how matte it has dried. I guess that's why it says matte fluid acrylic on the tube. Now for some airbrush testing. For all of these tests, I have my pressure set to about 35 psi. A bit higher than you might want for fine detail painting, but higher pressure should be better for thicker paints. And the point of this is using cheap paint for large surfaces, so I'm not going to be using this for any fine applications and thus don't really feel a need for low pressure. The first paint I thinned down was the Mont Marte, or whatever it's called, the burnt umber. I add the water, but I do think I added a bit too much in one go. The idea was to add it slowly until I achieved the consistency I wanted. It took a lot of mixing to get rid of the chunks in this, which was a little bit annoying, but not entirely unexpected. After a while, I added a bit more water. I probably should have done this a bit differently, adding smaller amounts of water more often. Once I had the paint mixed to what I thought was a good consistency, I figured I might see how it looks brushed onto the cardboard I used in the previous tests. This is obviously really thin. Too thin. I would say this is closer to a wash than paint, but hey, this is the reason I'm experimenting with this stuff. I was expecting this to not be very useful in the airbrush, but I figured I might as well try it anyway. It does work, but it definitely has a bit too much water. This might be alright for weathering or something like that, but you could easily spray too much and it would very easily run and produce bad results. You can see this paint did come out a bit spattery, which is obviously not great. I figured I would try this paint again, though with a little less water in the mix. I also made sure my airbrush was cleaned out properly, though I'm pretty sure that wasn't the reason for the spattering. This time it is a little bit thicker and it covers a little better, though I wasn't really satisfied with it. To get really good solid coatings with this, quite a few layers would be required. Not entirely surprising really. Also, it caused the brush to become a little blocked and splattery after a short while, and the paint would only come out in thick bursts. I could spend more time trying to optimize the ratio of water to paint with this color, but I didn't feel it was worth the effort to continue. Moving on to the chestnut. This time I was a bit more careful with how I added the water to the paint. I added fewer drops at 4 different times as I mixed. It did take a fair while. I tried brushing this watered down mix onto the cardboard again. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't cover all that well. You would have to do quite a few layers to get a good coating, but you could add a little bit more water and get a reasonable wash if you wanted one in that color. I think I got a pretty good mix this time, though I wasn't actually noting down how many drops of water I put in, because the blobs of paint weren't a measured amount, so I didn't bother. I think this is probably a case of having to eyeball it and guess for each brand and color of paint. This does work fairly well. I do remember this paint being one of the slightly more expensive ones, something like $5 or $6 versus the $2 or $3 the other brands cost. I don't know if that's just because you get more in the tube or if it's better quality pigment. The results aren't perfect, but they're not awful. Moving on to the black Student's Acrylic. This stuff is clearly very thick. It was reluctant to even leave the tube. It took a lot of water and stirring to get rid of the big clumps of paint here. Obviously those aren't going to do the airbrush any good, so they do need to be completely gone. This was pretty time consuming, so I think if I was going to do this regularly, I would mix up a larger batch in a jar or something. It actually brushes on pretty nicely. It almost covers just as well as the undiluted paint, and it definitely has fewer brush strokes. It's obviously a lot thinner, but it still has reasonably good coverage. It also goes through the airbrush surprisingly nicely. It's obviously a little thin, but it does cover quite well all the same. It's not quite as watery as the other paints, but it's still fairly easy to apply too much and get runs and such. This one actually worked a lot better than I thought it would. I was expecting the airbrush to clog, but it didn't. I think this mixture would work quite nicely for weathering or possibly creating burnt out looking structures, though I do have a black in the Sonja range that I think will require less thinning and mixing. Speaking of which, it is now time for the final paint, the Sonja Provincial Beige. I've kept this for last because I think it will work the best. Because of the fluidity this paint has, it required much less water and mixing than all the previous colours, so it was really quick and easy to prepare. It does brush on quite nicely with reasonable coverage, though as we saw before, it also brushes on pretty nicely without any dilution at all. I think for most terrain, this would be fine to use neat. Let's run it through the airbrush. Here's a patch of the black colour I used before. I figured the beige would show over this a little better than the plain cardboard. This sprays very nicely. It covers just as well as I expected, especially considering it's a light colour on a dark background. It isn't too watery, but it's still fluid enough to be quite easy to spray too much, so light coats are the way to go with this. A lot of paints you can airbrush with are the same way, really. I am pretty happy with this result. You can see there are bumps in the cardboard, which I think might be from the moisture in the paint, both black and beige, which you won't get on actual models. Other than that, I think it looks very good. This Sonja paint is definitely the kind I will be using for future terrain airbrushing applications. And probably the brush painting too. I have a few of these colours, but I will certainly be picking up more. They are reasonably cheap in art stores, ranging from $3 to $9 or $10. They do have what I think is a kind of strange tiering system, Series 1 colours being the cheapest. I'm not sure if that's a common thing for artist colours, but it seems some of them just cost more. Fortunately, for my purposes, there are plenty of usable colours in Series 1, so it's not a big deal. Of course, this brand might not be available all over the world, or even outside my city. I don't really know. Though to be fair, I don't think it's the brand specifically that makes the paint good. It's more the fact that it's a fluid, so if you can't find this particular brand, I would suggest trying to find paints with labels that say fluid acrylic or words to that effect. I have been searching around town for other brands that claim to be fluid acrylics, but so far I've only found more expensive varieties in art stores. The cheaper, thicker acrylics do work, but they take a little more effort, and like me, I think a lot of people would prefer the method that takes less effort. I think really it's just a matter of searching in your local art supply and dollar stores and experimenting with what you can find. So this video might not necessarily be helpful in that regard. I am of course no expert and don't really have much advice other than try to find paints with a more fluid consistency, but I figured I would share my findings anyway, as unscientific as they are. I would also be interested in hearing of any experiences, tips or tricks you might have discovered with paints like these. If you have any, leave them in the comments section below. That would be great. And of course, if you have any other comments, questions or suggestions, they would be welcome too. If you like this video, go ahead and click the thumbs up button. Thumbs down if you didn't like it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and of course share with anyone you think might find it useful or interesting. And if you really like what I do, please consider helping to support me via Patreon at patreon.com/Erpaderp. There's a link in the description you can follow to find that. It would be really appreciated, and anyone that contributes at least $10 dues a month will be sent a personalized thank you card. Though even just a couple of dollars a month would be really helpful and enable me to more quickly and easily make videos about the models you want to see. I'll be back again soon, so until then, happy modeling and thanks for watching. Farewell.